welcome to the Candid Tales podcast. We are sitting in isolation, removed from one another in our own little shafts as well. Circus in a shafts. I'm in my room. Welcome. We're going to chat about some Fionn stories, and we're going to answer some questions, get back to a bit of feedback, and let you know what we are doing in the Candid Tales realm of creativity. Sarika, what are you up to?
What am I up to? What am I up to?
We are writing the beats and a story for Battle of Entry.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm up to.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the king. I had a whole thing in my head yesterday about the king of the world. And like the psychology of the king of the world. I was getting really into it, and then I went to bed.
Well, that's alright. I mean, yesterday was the start of summer, Bealtaine.
Yeah.
The day of, or the very first day of summer, rather, I should say, and all of a sudden we were reminded, well, I am reminded, but that Fionn in Bealtaine down in Dingle, Fionn in Bealtaine, I should say, it would have been on this weekend, and we would have been down there performing in Dingle, and our plan was to perform the Battle of Entry as a live show, and we've been composing it now as a radio show instead, and
yeah, a radio play,
radio podcast thing. We're just playing around with loud noises. Radio play
is the genre we've decided on, which is kind of more dialogue voices, more Foley sound effects, more musical stuff going on. That's what we're doing.
So we're going to be releasing that over the coming weeks, which is a lot of fun. It's keeping us into the reading and researching of all the books and stuff. We're going to be doing some kid stories, because I live with Rue O'Shea, who's been going mad doing the sound effects and voices of a lot of the stories that we put together. So we have 10 stories already recorded now. We'll be releasing them on YouTube and other platforms, so stay tuned for that.
Speaking of platforms, we are finally on Apple Podcasts. Yay! We're on Apple Podcasts.
Not long at all.
I mean, listen, it was a little hard to get onto. But yeah, we're on Apple Podcasts, and we are, there. Which is great. Apple Podcasts has been a little tricky to get onto, but we're there now. So the whole podcast is up there for people who have iPhones or, like listening on Apple Podcasts rather than on any of the other platforms. You can tell people now that we are there, which is great.
Yay! Happy days. Now, we are, of course, live streaming this right now, just so that we can get a few more insights and people commenting and asking us questions, which is always nice. And we'll be releasing this podcast as one of our regular podcasts anyway, with the rest of them. So we're talking about a few specific of our last stories. We're actually going to be talking about 2 stories today. We're going to be talking about Diarmuid and the Daughter of Country Under Wave and the Battle of Slieve Gullion.
Hunt.
So we are... Sorry?
The Hunt of Slieve Gullion.
Oh yeah.
It's not a battle.
It's not a battle. It's
a hunt.
So in terms of the Diarmuid and the Daughter of Country Under Wave, the 2 stories really, basically the reason we're still talking about them is because we're still on a Fionn buzz, and we can't really get it off of it because, well, it's Bealtaine, it's summer, it's time to run around and go outside within 5 kilometres, and that's all I'll say about restrictions in your homestead. And I mean, we're just still on a Fionn buzz, so we want to keep on looking, keep on digging, and keep on enjoying the Fionn. I mean, Diarmuid and the Daughter of Country Under Wave is a bit of a mad one because it starts off with a cailleach, and maybe it's summertime. We don't quite know.
Well, it's interesting because the cailleach and the changing of the seasons is kind of a whole thing as well, because the winter time and when we're talking about summer and winter, like, this is traditional Celtic calendar stuff, which I think is like a month ahead of official modern stuff. So in terms of the cailleach and in terms of the winter time in Ireland, that is from Samhain to Bealtaine. from the 1st of November to the 1st of May. That's winter. That's the winter half of the year. Spring in Ireland begins on the 1st of February. Because that's Bridget's Day. But the Cailleach is associated with the changing of the seasons, and she's also associated with a lot of sovereignty myths. And in a lot of them, she transforms from hag to beautiful woman. And apparently there's a whole European tradition of the Lothian Lady, which Caitlin Moon was researching and realised actually starts in Ireland. And Ireland is also the only place where I think the Cailleach turns into a beautiful young woman. And in most countries, it's the other way around. So it's just kind of, there's all kinds of...
woman turns into an old hag.
Yeah, which we have a couple of stories like that as well. Like the Mongans, the end of the Mongan story, which is one of the king stories that we'll be telling over the summertime, is, has a beautiful woman turning into a hag. And I'll say no more about that because spoilers. But yeah, spoilers for these 1,000-year-old tales. But the Cailleach occupies a kind of an interesting position in Irish mythology and folktale. This old woman who's very, very powerful and magical and has, I suppose, the capacity to give all kinds of gifts and blessings if she chooses to.
In terms of, before we delve too much into the transformation of the Cailleach in this story, just in terms of Bealtaine, in terms of the fact that, the pagan rituals of jumping over the fire, it would have been 2 nights ago, on Bealtaine Eve, and running your cattle through to protect it. There was traditions of gathering the morning dew for your face or for whatever good luck charm you had.
That's February, I think, isn't it? That's in March.
No, it's
Bealtaine as well.
So there's a whole gathering of the dew in the morning for like skincare, and guys would catch snails, put them in flour and let them trail off and see if they would lead to them to their true love for the woman they'd marry. Random stuff. I don't know. I was reading a bunch of stuff, but I mean, it's really significant in terms of like the structure that we have on our lives, that we kind of just suddenly kick into. Oh, it's summer, and I guess I just reminded of the fact that it's summer without a lot of festivals that are usually going on right now, and it's a big running around and outside, and kind of that being removed, you still have this urge to go outside, and this kind of like revival in the tree, just greener, and the birds are singing, and all of a sudden it really is a chance to wake up into the season of it, and kind of going, right, yeah, okay, we're into the light half of the year, and it's the half. It's really nice to look at it that, like, the next half of the year, that's the dark half, starts in Samhain and runs to the following,
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a nice click to have in my head anyway of, we've just hit into the lighter half. Things get brighter this half.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever amongst the dark clouds that are brewing, it's nice to know that there's a nice half of lightness coming.
Yeah, I think you're a very summer person.
I am.
I think you're a very summer person. You like being outside. You like running around. You like your skin actually goes brown in the sun, as opposed to some of us who go crispy and sore. I'm also realizing as you're talking that I'm just like, yes, it is time to be itchy and too hot. So I'm not like,
that's definitely for you.
I'm definitely a dark half person. I love Halloween. I love Samhain. I love winter. I don't hate summer. No, it's not. Well, sometimes I hate summer, depending on the pollen count.
Sure, but into this abundant age anyway. The
Cailleach
walk.
Definitely hate festivals. It's not their fault. There's too many people.
To stop you from saying that.
I know.
Anyway,
you can't.
Never mind, you big introvert. So the Cailleach is walking along. She's all old and grey and not very for herself. And we're looking. This is all of a sudden the Cailleach, which is like a harbour, a bit of doom. She's brought some prophecies of death before. She seems to be pretty cranky in lots of various stories. This particular hag, not necessarily a hag of any location, it's just a Cailleach, and she's walking along in search of somebody to break the curse that she's under. She's not really sure what's going on, but she finds the Fianna, and she's hoping that they're going to break the curse that she's under. And then she has this transformation into the beautiful Colleen. Yeah. It's kind of a sudden one, right?
Well, it's a funny one, like in terms of the fear of women and the fear of kind of, you know, I'm thinking of, what's the name of that book? I think it's From the Bitch to the Blonde, and I'm trying to remember the authors of it. But basically, that there's a whole series of like tropes in folktale and mythology that are really about a kind of a coded fear of female sexuality. Like, you know, sirens and mermaids whose bottom half is monstrous and their top half is beautiful. And the particular way that the Cailleach in Irish mythology behaves is very sexual. Like she wants to come into the house and go to bed with a young man. That's how she gets to break her curse. And like all of these really strong, brave Fianna warriors are afraid and disgusted by her. And there's something about like, there's got to be something in there about maturation and like a mature man not being afraid of female sexuality. Because you see it in the Niall of the Nine Hostages story as well. It's when he lies down with the Cailleach. It's after he lies down with the Cailleach that she becomes a beautiful woman and gives him the kingship of Ireland. And in this story, it's after Diarmuid lets her into his bed, although he keeps a little rigid blanket between them, that she turns into a beautiful young woman. And like
pretty cunning on Diarmuid's like, you're just gonna that little line between us. Just don't touch me with your ick. Ick.
But it's after he lets her into his bed that she becomes the beautiful young woman. And so there's something about like, I don't know, I don't know exactly how to land what that means, but I think there's something interesting in there about like, yeah, fear of female sexuality and the rewards of confronting that fear. That's just kind of interesting.
Fionn gets an opportunity, Oisin gets an opportunity, and they both close the door in front of the Cailleach and the hag for fear of her grossness or age and all of the whatever descriptions that we have in that story of the Cailleach looking as potentially gross as you can be. But I do find it interesting that we never get a description of a saggy, testicled old man.
No,
you know,
because
like it's always you don't get a really old ick man.
Yeah, but that's what I'm.
The fear of sexuality.
That's what I'm talking about, because like that's one of the descriptions of the Cailleach that I came across and have used in every story since, and I think you have as well, is the pubic hair being visible dangling down between the rents of the cloak, because we're not disgusted by male sexuality in the same way in our culture. There isn't a level of revulsion associated with it, where there is with female sexuality. And it goes right through everything. It goes right through the way that, like, we don't tell women with the correct names for their genitals. You know, the idea that, like, vulva is a dirty word, but penis isn't. Even though it's, like, they're technical terms. But people get really squeamish about when we're talking about women. And women's bodies, and it goes like it has serious impacts, like in healthcare it has serious impacts, and like, you know, you think about the level of revulsion there is around kind of periods and period products, and like it's a big deal for a guy to buy his girlfriend, you know, menstrual products because it's seen as like this terrifying, grotesque thing. So no, we don't have the same level of revulsion around men and men's bodies getting older. We do have that level of revulsion around women and female bodies getting older. And I think it's really interesting to see how that's kind of dealt with in Irish myth. Because in Irish myth, it's like it's acknowledged and it's there, but it's also like, if you can get past it, that's the path of the hero. The you know, it's right. Whereas in other mythologies you're not encouraged to get past it. You're like, you think of Greek mythology and the kind of Medusa characters, that they're allowed to just be terrifying. Whereas in Irish mythology,
have a kind of transformation.
yeah, you don't get to just see it as terrifying. You have to confront your own terror and go through it, and then you get everything. And like that's Diarmuid gets magically everything. He gets a magic girlfriend who can give him everything. Where's the place for the nicest? Where's the best place for a house in Ireland? That hill over there. Boom, there's a house there. You know what I mean? She is a magic girlfriend who can give him fucking everything, except apparently she doesn't get puppies.
I mean, chipped in there and says because histories and stories were written by men, and that's essentially what we're talking about here is like the fact that we're looking at these stories from potentially a perspective. And what I've never really pieced together before is the Cailleach being a representation of female sexuality that men are afraid of. And that's kind of something that definitely makes sense now a lot more when I ask myself, why isn't there a male equivalent to the Cailleach? There's lots of druids, there's lots of esteemed, wise old men, but you don't get the Cailleach. Whereas the Cailleachs seem to fit both. They offer out wisdom. They sometimes are the saving trope in a story, or bring redemption to the character, or bring doom. In this case, it's a woman who has been kind of randomly cursed to be old and wizened and walk Ireland until she meets somebody who is able to restore herself to her beauty and acknowledge her as a human being. That's essentially what she's asking for.
Yeah.
It's just to be acknowledged, to be led across the border of someone's lodging, just to be able to, and like, Christ, don't we all know how important it is to just go around and call in for a cup of tea now that we don't get to do that anymore. And that's the thing, she's being refused her right to be a human because she's been seen as disgusting, and she's been put in this place of, you're gross, you have to stand over there at arm's length, and lost all of her humanity and being in touch with society.
Actually, when you take the female perspective in these stories, you can get a gross version of an old man. And actually we had it when we were talking about Diarmuid and Grania. Because we talked about revulsion, we talked about Grania's revulsion of a young woman agreeing to marry an old man and then realising what that actually meant. And I think it's, that's kind of an interesting one as well, because we have also told this story in the past from her perspective. And this curse starts with her refusing the advances of a man that she's not attracted to. And I think you could get into a discussion about revulsion there as well. And like, this is his punishment on her, which is the same as the setup for the Scythe story. She refuses the advances of a druid who turns her into a deer. And in both cases it's like the woman is equated by these men with her physicality, and so his punishment to her is to change her physicality so that she is worth less. And her way of getting back to humanity is actually by finding someone who acknowledges that she has worth, even if she doesn't have beauty of female form. So without being objectified as a beautiful woman, that she has worth, which I just think is kind of an interesting, and it's interesting that this kind of comes up a couple of times in the Fionn stories. It's a while back now since we told Scythe, but there is the telling of Scythe in our podcast. I can't remember what episode it is right now, but if anyone's interested in listening to that for kind of parallels to this story, it isn't wildly different in kind of setup.
So the story goes again. It's Diarmuid and the daughter of Country Underwave, daughter of King Underwave, and you can listen back to it from last week if you haven't listened to it already, or you can just hear us chat away about it. Because essentially, what happened? There's two more things I want to talk about in his story. Diarmuid goes. He messes up, basically. He breaks his promise to her, and for some reason the curse comes back on her and she's deathly sick, so he has to go and rescue her. So that's kind of, he breaks his word to her and has to charge her off underneath the Country Underwave. And then she gives him this impossible task to cure him. Go get the healing cup from the King of the Plain of Wonder, but you can't get it, essentially, because the border of my father's land is divided by a huge river that you can't cross. Enter Little Red Man, who carries Diarmuid across the river because he can.
Yep.
Now, please explain Little Red Man in this story. Where did Little Red Man come from? What is going on? It makes no sense. You're supposed to take a year to sail across it, and suddenly Little Red Man can run across the river with Diarmuid in his hand.
He is a god from the machine. He is a deus ex machina. That is what he is. And this is something that's kind of like a thing that is very criticized in sort of modern storytelling. That the thing that you don't want to do is write yourself into a corner so that you have to have like God come down and save people. But it happens all the time in mythology. And that's actually where the term comes from. I think in Greek theatre, you would have the gods come down and intercede. And they would be, come onto the stage. They would come out of the machinery of the stage. Which, as far as I know, is where that term actually kind of originates. But yeah, it's kind of seen as bad storytelling these days to have a deus ex machina, although it still happens all the time. But it happens like all the time in mythology. Because I think in mythology, you're always dealing with forces that are beyond human agency and human ken. And modern storytellers don't like that because we live in a much more mechanized world where we like to think that we have control over everything. Times like these are very good at showing us that is completely incorrect, and we are walking around in a fantasy when we think that. But you want to tell a story these days. The aim is to tell a story where your heroes wrestle with the problem and resolve it themselves. But this is just like it's another feature of Irish mythology and mythology in general, that like outside forces will just turn up, and sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're not. And in this case, Diarmuid has an ally because of his motivation. But really it's just because the storyteller telling it is like, oh man, I want this to be hard and I want everyone to understand that this is going to be really hard, but also I don't want to tell the story of him taking a year to cross this river. So, shortcut.
This is true. And we're a shortcut, and we're into a little bit of like, okay, need a trope, but also need to show a bit of magic, need to get another character in, need to have something. So it is a little bit of a twist and a little bit of a trick. Now the question of who is that character has come up a couple of times when we've told this story. He's a couple of options, right? He could be a few different people.
I think you told him as Manon McLear once. But yeah, he's not explained. He's not explained as who he is. He's just a little Fardarg. Oh, do you have a theory?
I think. Sorry, we talked about it. It was Angus Oak that I actually named him as, because he was his foster father in so many stories. So I basically put two. I was like, all right, he has to be a foster father figure. Now, on Gods and Men, the Lady Gregory version that I used for this version again, I went back and she explains him as a man who's of the Fae, who's come to help Diarmuid out because his heart is so hot for the healing of another that he wants to help him. So he just kind of finds a way to throw out of it. We have had a question in. So Marie McGee says, great story with lots of twists, but early on Diarmuid should have told her why the pups were so important to him. So I
agree. This goes back a step to why they have the fight. But I also think like there's something really interesting about the way that the Fae and the fairies and the Tuatha Danann are sometimes depicted in folklore and in storytelling, and they don't have the same kind of morality as humans, and I think often that comes out as a kind of a lack of empathy. She doesn't intuitively understand why puppies are important, which means it is probably a really good thing that they did not stay together and have lots of babies, because I think she would not understand why a baby was important, because that's the kind of like lack of empathy that's actually a little bit indicative. I think it's a little bit indicative of her kind of lack of humanity, that there's actually a huge there's a disconnect here, because like they don't communicate particularly effectively. I agree with Mur there, where she's like, he should have just told her these puppies are important to me because I love them, and she should have got that. But who needs it explained to them that puppies are important?
Yeah, in fairness, any small animal, baby animal of any size, or whatever, it's just like just don't give away the baby things. And I guess if you have to be explained that, then you're out of touch with it.
That's a pretty big word. Like, just as a blanket thing, if somebody doesn't get, like, if somebody isn't protective of small creatures, that's a pretty big red flag right there.
Again, to counter that, I mean, like, she's to take her position in it. She looks out and she sees the leader of the Fionn coming towards her, asking for a puppy, and she's like, "Yeah, well, of course." And then one of his friends, and like each time, it just seems like, well, it's just such a small thing to give away because I'm part of kind of this world now, and you want this, apparently. Who am I to stop you from having it? And she's just kind of abundant in her giving and very gracious and very, like, wanting to please the others. And I guess, like, yeah, maybe that's out of touch with a bit of humanity. Sure.
But it's, I take
give.
your point. She's trying to fit in. She's trying to fit in and she doesn't really understand what the rules are, and the rest of the Fianna are being a big old bunch of trolls.
Yeah, they're not helping.
It is not cool. Like, they're actively trying to break them up.
Yeah, they're messing with her.
They're totally messing with her, and they're totally messing with him, and it's not really that cool. So
last point on this story is the ending is kind of heartbreaking. It's always sad. And it's this big old Diarmuid with the love spot, the beautiful Diarmuid Divna, saves the woman of his dreams, and in saving her, his love for her evaporates. And it just goes back to the futility of love, how quick and easy it can be, the fact that she's still in love with him, which is a real kicker. And she looks at him and says, "Oh, Diarmuid, the love you have for me is gone." And he's like,
yeah.
Yep. Like, I think we all felt it. As soon as we hear it, we all feel it in different ways or whatever. But I certainly, like, when you tell this story, I'm just like, we've both felt that, and also kind of like
been the one who had to say that. Yeah, I think most people who've been in relationships and been through at least one breakup have been on one side or the other or both of that, and both of them are awful. Yeah. Because it's a case of like, sometimes that happens.
But it's such an amazing, like, I love this story because it gets that. It gets that, even like, the morning after a brief encounter, you could be in love with someone the night before, and then that morning you're like, I really I'm not into this anymore. But I mean, like, it encapsulates a mood that is so human, and so, because we get infatuated, we get excited, we get super, like, we fall in love really easily, some of us.
I was gonna say, speak for yourself, kid.
But it's a really human emotion, I think.
I do, yeah.
Infatuated, especially a younger mind. It's a very young thing to fall in love very, very hard, very heavily, and fall out of love just as quickly. And it's just, it's jarring when it happens, but to see it portrayed in myth as this magic spell that he is so loving in a way that he offers his love in order to heal her, it's a hugely generous offering, and yet is devastating as well, because we feel it and we connect to it because it's so automatically, it hits the nail on the head as how we actually behave, which I don't think myths always do.
I think this one certainly does. There's a question in from Charles McCoy who says, do you think that may have to do with the Celts' propensity to allow divorces on either side as opposed to other cultures? And yeah, I think so. I think there's an acknowledgement in the mythology that this is a thing that happens. And like that was the tradition of hand fasting, which was that you got married for a year before you got married was also a thing in Irish law and in early Irish law, that like you were allowed to have almost a trial marriage for a year beforehand.
Great idea. It's a great idea. Like,
And
when did
like,
we stop doing that? Thanks very much.
well, now we have cohabitation, which people often do. But like you did have like you had divorce. Divorce was a thing that could be brought. You could bring a case for divorce on either side for various different reasons. People kept their own property. There was no kind of enmeshing of property that we like we do now. Women retain their own property, men retain their own property. So yeah, I think that there's a kind of it's quite possible that this sort of, we often talk about the somewhat cynical nature of Irish mythology when it comes to love, that there's very few love stories where people fall in love and live happily ever after. And I think that's true, where you have a culture where divorce is okay and kind of normal. Happily ever after isn't so set in stone. Whereas in other cultures where divorce isn't legal, marriage is the end, because whether you're happy or not, that's it. You can't get out of it. So the fairy tale ends there.
What I think it alludes to give another answer to Charles McCoy, is that the Celts had an awareness of a more sophisticated, potentially a more mature awareness of human emotions that were portrayed in stories, whether it had to do with technicalities as divorce or laws or rights or anything like that. That was something that might have come out of it, but it definitely highlights and shows an awareness of a more complicated array of emotions that human beings go through, and portraying this in story equates to basically teaching and learning from it, and being able to show that human love is a very complicated emotion, and one that can stop and can end. And so then potentially the opportunities for divorce and laws to come out of that kind of society would be built on foundations of a more mature awareness of human emotions, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I don't want to get into any kind of cultural comparison, because we just don't have the knowledge to say what other cultures' level of maturity is. So it's kind of, but I do think it's it is interesting to note that these are stories where, yeah, the Celts did allow divorce, and so yeah, it's kind of an interesting one. Shall we move on to the Hunt of Steve Gullion?
Yes, indeed. This is well done. I haven't heard you tell this one in ages.
I haven't told this one before.
More details. Well, you told me it, but you hadn't told it live.
Yeah, that's what I mean. This was kind of an interesting one for me, because this was the first time that I've told a story on the podcast that we haven't told in a live show first, which was interesting because I definitely realised how much I rely on telling a story live, especially the first time you do it, because, knowing the beats but then saying it in front of an audience really, really allows you to feel your way through the story and feel like what's landing and what's not landing. And I just kind of had to do that without the feedback that you get from an audience. So it was kind of interesting. I found that more, just, it changed the process a lot for me. But it was okay in the end. I got there. It was just kind of it was a funny one to notice that was really kind of like, how am I doing? But yeah, the Hunt of Steve Gullion, yeah, hadn't told it live. Had told you it in the way that I'm kind of like, oh, there's a story where this happens, but hadn't told it as a performance.
Yeah, no, it's funny because that process, I guess, it becomes, I guess, a different form of storytelling,
Yeah.
Because you don't have that response, which is interesting. But I luckily, we still have this story. You still have your telling of it. It's one of the few times that you really see Fionn being very, very debilitated.
Yeah. Well, it happens a couple of times. It happens a couple of times because it happens in the we have another episode of the podcast which is the Hostel of the Quicken Trees, where Fionn gets stuck to the floor. There's another story where they go into a cave and get stuck to the floor. It happens to him actually a fair bit. I'm just thinking through Fiona's stories now, because if you think about Cuana's house as well, the hospitality of Cuana's house, that's another one where he gets nearly stuck to the floor by supernatural kind of entities. Poor Fionn gets stuck to the floor a fair few times, or its equivalent.
Yeah, but he's not on his own in those things.
That's true.
Like in Cuana's house, there's this one dude who he's never really in any danger.
Yeah.
With the others. With Spell and the Hospital Quicken Tree, he gets rescued and there's a big fight and they eventually get out of it and they fight and they kill the King of the World and stuff. In the other one, again, he's with a few of the other guys and they're all stuck and they're all worried. This one, he's isolated. He's all of a sudden he's turned into an old man and he's not even recognised by his own dogs.
Yeah, that's true actually. He's totally alone and he's totally vulnerable. And I think there's something in this story about, the fear of aging. That's really, really strong because Fionn, and we were talking about this earlier, there are various different versions of the death of Fionn McCool. And, he may have died at the Battle of Gowra, and he may have not died and gone under the hill and kind of is sleeping there and waiting for his reawakening. Or there's a story where Fionn leaps over a gap. I think it's on the Boyne River. He leaps from cliff to cliff. And there's a very, very narrow ledge that only lets 1 foot on it. And this is his test that he does every year on his birthday to make sure that he is still physically fit. With the knowledge that on the day that he won't make the leap, he will plunge to his death. And that's how Fionn McCool feels about getting old.
Surefire way not to feel old and crickety. Just keep on jumping off the cliff until you fall and die.
Yeah. That's his way of being, and that's his kind of way of dealing with his own fear of aging, is to just go okay, as soon as I start failing, I'm this is a conditional suicide. As long as I'm not failing, I get to live. And as soon as my body starts failing, that's it. Which is really kind of harsh. But I mean, we know some people like that. Hi, Tony.
Hey, Dad. Thanks for becoming a Patreon supporter, Dad. We appreciate it.
Well, just as somebody who frequently said, when I get to that age, take me up on top of a mountain.
Just shove me off.
I was very much thinking of our dad. I was very much thinking of our dad when I was recording this story, actually, because I just kind of was thinking of somebody who is very physically fit and physically active and takes such joy in physicality and in movement and in sport and in all of those kinds of things. It really made me think of Fionn running through the forest on his hunt, and really just kind of I really wanted to kind of play up that contrast of being in the full of your youth and then suddenly being hit with this aging, which is really sudden and really awful.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a beautiful comparison to draw because, and I'm sure we all know people like it, but our father certainly, I think he's dealing with an aging right now. It's the slow, gradual decline, because
which
he's
is
aware of arthritis. It's a very natural thing. Everyone goes through it, and you just get that bit more crickety, that bit less, and he's he's dealing with it pretty well. He's not old yet, as he'd like to say. He's still giving out about his back or his ankle or his elbow or whatever it is, but
always been the case.
To be ripped from, like you said, a man who's fully able and fully has no problems, who's running through the forest, all of a sudden to be to be put in the body of a male Cailleach, which we don't actually have, apparently. But that's essentially what he's done. He's become old, withered, decrepit, sore, in pain, can't move, and grey as anything.
And I think to your point earlier, the dual horror of this is that he is also alone. Like he's away from the Fianna, and that's fine when he's strong. But when Bran and Skjolon don't recognise him, I think that's really terrifying. He's completely alone and cut off from the Fianna, and he's left sat there, too weak to walk home, with no dogs who know him, no people who know him, nobody to help him, nobody to support him, until the rest of the Fianna find him. And what do they do when they find him? They think he's a fisherman and they threaten to kill him. Nice one, lads. Like Quincy McCronan is like, oh, who's this weird old dude? Have you seen Fionn McCool? And if you don't tell me right now where he went, I'm going to stab you. That's a whole thing.
Like the aspect of him becoming very old is, again, it's one of those things in mythology you find you're like, all right, that's very global, very something you can identify with.
It's very universal, yeah.
And that's clearly a fear everybody has, is getting old, getting sore, and feeling the aging process happen. We all feel it. We all know we weren't as sharp as we were.
Aaron has stalled.
21.
All right, it's just because he was shouting.
The vision comes.
The video freezes when you shout. Your face.
Right, well, let me pick up where I left off without shouting.
Yeah.
I'll not shout. Their solution here, story, is bug one of the Fae and batter on his gaff, basically, and try and dig him up and annoy one of the fairies until they'll turn him back.
Well, I think there's something that I want to talk about before that, which is why he gets enchanted. Because he gets enchanted. Like I had, this was one of the things that I struggled with a little bit in telling the story, and it wasn't until I found a version of the story that gave a satisfactory explanation that I was happy to record it. Because there are versions of this where it's the two sisters, Anya and Malucra, who both try to seduce him, and he chooses Anya, and this is Malucra's revenge, and that didn't connect for me as a motivation. And maybe it would for some people, and maybe that says more about me. But then I found a version of the story that said that no, Anya and Malucra were sisters and rivals. And Anya had a gesh on her never to get involved with an older man. And that's why Malucra did this to Fionn McCool. He's completely collateral to this power struggle between two sisters of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And like, there's something very mythic and Tuatha Dé Danann-ish about that, where it's like your absolute worst fear, the worst thing that could possibly happen to you, I didn't even pick it to get at you. It just so happens to be the way of getting at somebody else. And that's where the Tuatha Dé Danann come in as these like huge inhuman forces. They don't even care enough about him. She doesn't even care enough about him that this is his worst possible fear. She's not doing this to target him specifically. She's doing this to target her sister. Because her sister has a gesh on her, and if her sister is involved with Fionn McCool, and actually we don't know if the gesh is broken by this technicality. Maybe it is and maybe it isn't, because he doesn't stay an old man, so we don't know. But yeah, I kind of love that. I love that aspect of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and I also think, like, you know, for the times that we are in right now, where we are all feeling the pinch of huge forces that are outside of our control, that we're not used to in modernity. Like, our ancestors were very used to this. If you had a couple of weeks of not enough rain, too much rain, you know, you would feel it immediately, how at the mercy of nature we really are. But I think most of us in the modern world are removed enough that we can kid ourselves that that isn't the case anymore. And things like this current situation remind us of our place, which is very vulnerable. And I think, you know, you can see people freaking out about that. People are really like, you know, saying, "Oh no, it's a conspiracy," or "Oh no, it's the government." It's not. It's nature. We are vulnerable to nature. We are creatures that are here as guests on the planet, and we are shitting on the carpet, so to speak. And we are you know, this is us getting put in our place.
You were going so well there, like you were doing way to round up the whole thing and just shitting on the carpet. way to really bring it home there, sis.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. I mean,
very nice.
am I wrong? I'm not wrong.
Stop shitting on the carpet. Please.
Yeah, come on,
All right,
humanity.
if you're listening back to this, don't shit on the carpet. Alright?
Don't shit on the carpet when you're a guest. It's a metaphor.
But also not really.
Listen, the best metaphors work on several levels.
All of the levels. Come here, I think this is actually pretty good time to wrap up. Anna, a message in there saying it is very interesting that comparison with Greek myth and how Greek myth women are rarely are given agency. We inherited misogyny from the Greeks. No, we inherited a lot from the Greeks. And I'm glad to see people laughing and responding. But I also just wanted to say that I listened to a very good podcast called Lorini B. I'll put the link in here. Oh, and they have a great podcast on it's folklore study, and your man has a little look at Dean Kecht and a comparison in Greek mythology, and quite a similarity. To kind of do an episode on Dean as well. But like, yes, of course, there's an awful lot of mythology in Greek myths. There's an awful lot of everything in Greek myth, though. The comparison doesn't quite.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with blaming the Greeks for all of misogyny. I do think there is a lot of misogyny that was written down in Greek mythology, but you know, that is a thing that happened on a nearly global level at some point, you know, around 2,000 years ago, or maybe longer ago, and I don't think it originated in Greece, but I think that fear of and desire to control women and women's bodies and women's sexuality, it's not a Greek thing. But we're still trying to deal with it. And I think Irish mythology is an interesting one in terms of the way that it deals with it.
All right, look, I think we'll take our advice from our lovely mother who's saying, maybe leave that one there, lads. But I think we will leave it there. Thank you very much for tuning in and listening in with us. We recap there on episode 36 and 37 of the Candid Tales podcast. If you haven't heard those stories, I want to check them out. There you go. We'll be catching up with ourselves now. We'll be releasing a new podcast on Wednesday, and we'll be doing about that next Saturday as well, because that's the crack. So
yep.
We're doing, and we're going to be studying a lot more of Battle of Entry, and we're going to be releasing content on Patreon page about that and our process of devising a show. And we'll be getting some kid stories out to you soon as well. So stay tuned, keep her lit, stay safe, stay healthy, and don't shit in the carpet.
And you can support us on Patreon if you like what we're doing. And you can follow us on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, and now on Apple Podcasts. And if you like, you know, there's two ways of supporting us. You can do it directly on Patreon by throwing us a few quid every month, or the PayPal button on our website for throwing us a few quid once off. Or you can share, and sharing and telling people about it and commenting and liking and subscribing also really, really, really helps us. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for your contributions. And keep it lit till next time.